Hello, this is Dennis Martin, and this is another in our series of lessons from the Gospel of Matthew from Marion Road Christian Church. This lesson is from Matthew 25, and it's the second part of something that we call the Olivet Discourse. We've been going through a series of chapters near the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and these all are related to Jesus' last week in Jerusalem before his crucifixion, his death, and then his resurrection. And we're on Tuesday. Tuesday was a long day, and there's more in Matthew about it than there is about any other day. We have gone through in the previous lessons, the previous chapters, what happens mostly Tuesday morning, maybe a little after that, where Jesus has been in the temple, has been confronted by the Jewish leaders, answered all of their questions, and really silenced all of them. After that, he leaves the temple and goes to the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and that's where we are now, in the middle of something called the Olivet Discourse, often called that. And it's the last of the five great discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 24 is the first half. Chapter 25 is the second half, and we're on chapter 25 today. Now, as Jesus leaves the temple, Jesus looks back at it and says to the disciples, Do you see all of these things? Truly, I tell you that not one stone will be left on another, which is going to be torn down. And that statement prompts a couple questions from the disciples, and it prompts this Olivet Discourse, which is Jesus' answer. The two questions really are, when are these things, meaning the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, when are these things going to happen? And the second question is, what will be the signs of your coming and the end of the age? The disciples probably thought they were the same question, but they're really, really quite different questions, and Jesus treats them that way. Chapter 24 answers the first question, and it starts to answer the second question. The short answer to the first question was the temple and Jerusalem are going to be destroyed within this generation. And the temple, in fact, was destroyed in 70 AD, just as Jesus had said. And it was a very horrible time indeed, from all of the accounts. Over 1 million people probably killed, over 100,000 enslaved, and Jerusalem and the temple completely destroyed. Then the answer to the second question, which is, when will you return and what will be the signs of the times? What are going to be the signs that you return? Begins partway through chapter 24 and it continues in chapter 25. The short answer is, and the short answer he gives in chapter 24 right at the beginning, is that nobody knows. Therefore, you must be ready. And the rest of chapter 24 is a set of short parables about the importance of being ready and the consequences of not being ready. And then chapter 25 continues some parables and teaching about the end times. And again, the messages are, no one knows when the time will come. Therefore, you must be ready. If you are ready, you will be rewarded. If you are not ready, you will be punished. And these are some of the longer and better known parables. They are the wise and the foolish virgins, or the 10 bridesmaids, the parable of the talents, and the sheep and the goats. And those are what we're going to look at today. First of all, the wise and foolish bridesmaids. Now, a couple comments to begin with. One should not try to make this story too allegorical with lots of hidden meanings and in every little detail, and who the bridesmaids represent and all sorts of things. They really represent people, and the bridegroom who is coming represents Jesus, but it doesn't get much more allegorical than that. The overall meaning is that we need to be ready, and that when the time comes, it will be too late to prepare. Now, a few comments about Jewish weddings in Jesus' day. Marriages were among the most joyful times in the towns and villages. Uh, Life was often hard, and marriages were a chance to celebrate and everyone to join together and celebrate in a once in a lifetime joyful event. So they were a very happy time. Now, most marriages were arranged. It's not that the future husband and wife didn't know each other, didn't love one another, but the arrangements were made by their fathers. The men were often a little older than the ladies were. When they became engaged, they were often engaged about a year before the actual wedding. And according to custom, they were legally married at that time. They were legally considered married at that time. But they were still living separately and would live separately until the actual marriage ceremony about a year later. When that time came, and it was often in the fall of the year, um, in the fall of the year, the crops were harvested. It was not so hot. Everybody had a little more free time, and as with us, it's sort of customary to have weddings in June, although you can have them other times. But but the idea of June weddings for us is similar to the idea of fall weddings for the people in Palestine in Jesus' day. So when the time came for the wedding, the groom would go to the bride's house to get her and then bring her back to his house. Everyone was all dressed up in their wedding finery. It was a festival for the whole town. There were processions, and he would go to get her. He would bring her back to his home, and then the party would begin that night. But the next day would be the actual wedding. That evening, the bride and groom continued to stay separate. And the actual wedding was then the next day, and that was the first night that they would spend together. The total festivities often lasted 5 to 7 days, almost a week. One important point in this particular story is a lamp. These little clay lamps. They look to us sort of like a little pitcher or a gravy boat or a genie lamp or something, but they're made out of clay. They're about big enough to hold in your hand. They have a hole in the middle that oil, usually olive oil, can be poured in, and then out of the spout there is a wick that comes, and the wick is lighted, and then it burns the oil and is a lamp. And that is an important symbol in the idea of being ready. So you'll see the lights as we go through the story. Another question is, who are the bridesmaids? Well, the bridesmaids are members of the wedding party. They're the bride's attendants. They could be her friends, they could be her family, they could be neighbors, they could be people from the groom's house and household, but they are her wedding attendants, and they wait with the bride at her home for the bridegroom to come. They know the day the bridegroom is going to come. Everybody knows the day here, but they don't know the time that the groom will arrive. And the role of the bridesmaids in the wedding is to escort the bride and the groom in a festive procession from the bride's house to the groom's house. There's sort of a torchlight parade. Well, there's a torchlight parade sort of coming over, and then the lamps are added to the light as they return to the groom's house. And these, as I showed you, these oil lamps made out of clay and wicks, with wicks. Some of the bridesmaids are characterized as being wise, and some are characterized as being foolish. And it means here that some were prepared and some were not prepared. Because in the parable, in the story, the bridegroom is delayed. The girls are waiting at the bride's house, and the bridegroom doesn't come, and he doesn't come, and he doesn't come, and it gets later and later and later. The girls get tired and they fall asleep. Now, both the wise and the foolish bridesmaids fall asleep. It wasn't necessarily a terrible thing to fall asleep. Having fallen asleep was not bad. What was bad was not being prepared. And so we'll see what that means, because the girls were asleep when suddenly they hear the voice saying, the bridegroom is coming, and it's about midnight. So they wake up, they can look out, they can see the lights approaching. There is the man who is, what we would call the best man, leading the procession with his torch. The bridegroom is following. Others in his part of the wedding party are following, maybe people from the village, and they are almost at the bride's home. But there's a problem. The girls hear the sound, the bridegroom is coming, they wake up, but their lamps are out of oil. Now, the wise bridesmaids brought more oil in little jars, little clay jars probably, but the foolish ones didn't. Or the prepared ones brought oil, and the ones who were not prepared just kind of forgot about that. So the foolish or the unprepared ones asked to borrow oil from the wise ones. And the wise ones said, no, then we will not have enough oil either. Go get some oil for yourselves. Now, this is not selfishness. I saw this written about in one place as the parable of the selfish bridesmaids. It's not selfishness at all, because the point of the parable is that no one else can be prepared for you. You have to be prepared yourself. I must be prepared for myself. Any person must be prepared and is responsible for being prepared, himself or herself. And preparation is not just wishful thinking. Preparation is actually action. And in this case, the girls were not prepared. So while they were gone getting oil, and they hurried to leave, but while they were gone getting the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The bride goes out to meet her groom. Her attendants come. They have their lamps. They surround the bridegroom and the groom, and the procession starts back to the groom's house. And everyone smiles. It's a very happy, a very joyful procession. And when they get back to the bridegroom's home, everyone goes inside. Now, the unprepared bridesmaids missed the whole procession. They were gone getting oil. And when these unprepared bridesmaids finally get to the bridegroom's house, they've gone and gotten oil, they have their oil, they fill their lamps, they light their lamps, they make their way to the bridegroom's house. The door is already shut, and everyone else is inside. So the bridegroom or the bridesmaids call out to the people inside, and they say, open the door for us. We're here now. But they are told, and they're not told just by some grumpy doorkeeper, but they are told by the bridegroom himself. He replies, truly I tell you, I don't know who you are. And they are left standing on the outside. The message of this parable is simple. You need to keep watch and be prepared, because you do not know the day or the hour when Jesus will return. There is more to being prepared than just keeping watch. That being prepared also requires some action. The last parable of the group the second parable of the group is the parable of the talents, and it also is a fairly well-known parable. It continues the same theme as the previous parable, that idea of being prepared, and it also includes a coming or a return. And it's similar, although not identical, to a parable in Luke 19. But it explains something not really touched on in the bridesmaids' parable. And that is, what does it mean to be prepared? Because being prepared is not just passively waiting for someone to return, at least not the way Jesus is describing it. He says the responsibility of the one is not just to wait, but to be active and produce results for the master until he comes. That waiting is a time of opportunity. Now, talent in the parable of the talents is, of course, an amount of money. It's not some sort of a special aptitude like we think of a talent for music or for an athletic event or something. A talent is an amount of money, and the value of it varies, but it's thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not as if the master who was leaving gave each of the servants $10 or $20 or even $100. He gave them each a lot of money, thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the talents in the parable represent opportunities or responsibilities that one is given in the kingdom, and we'll talk about how we know some of that in a little bit. And the readiness here means how faithfully one has served the master while the master was away, according to the responsibilities that the master had given us. And the responsibilities, like the money in the parable, would vary among individuals then and now. A couple things about the parable to begin with. It starts with this word again. Now that links closely with the previous parable, especially this keep watch, because you do not know the hour when the Son of Man is coming. So again links it to that the lesson is going to be the same. We already know what the lesson will be. It in the parable is the kingdom of heaven. That refers back to the beginning of the previous parable in verse 1, where he says, the kingdom of heaven is like. So then again, it will be like. So similar parable, similar message is going to come through. This one also is about the kingdom of heaven and about the coming of the Son of Man. The NIV translation uses bags of gold instead of talents, which is probably fine, because the value of a talent of money varied depending on the time, on the place, on the type of metal, because about talent is really a weight. But the talents or the bags of gold are responsibilities that were given out according to abilities, as the parable says, and they're given to the three servants. One was given the most, the second was given the second most, and the third was given a little. The first two apparently understood their responsibilities, that their responsibilities were not just to protect this talent, but were to put it to work, to do business with it, to trade with it, to work with it, and make it grow, to use that talent. The third, though, apparently misunderstood, and he substituted the idea of security for service. And these become important for us to remember when we're thinking about the point of the parable being that it explains what it means to be ready. So we'll look at what he says. The talents were given out. After a long time, the master comes back. It's a long time, but it's not a known time. They didn't know when the master would return. So it's implied then that they needed to be ready. And when the master comes back, he wants to settle accounts with them. That makes it clear that the expectation was that they'd been given the money for trading and business and to make it grow. They'd been expected to do something with it, and that had been expected from the very start. The achievement of the first two was very similar. They had both doubled the amount of money that had been given them. And because of what they had done, they were given equal rewards. But it's interesting to note that the reward was not a pension. The reward was actually getting more responsibility. But there was more to it than that. And perhaps more important was the invitation to come share in your master's happiness. This is not just, you get a promotion. But part of the application of the parable is that there will be an additional reward to be with the master and to share the master's happiness because of what one has done with the responsibilities that have been given while the master is away. So the share in your master's happiness is a big point of this parable. The third servant. The third servant had been given the smallest amount of money, but he missed the point. And even though he missed the point, he was still irresponsible because the other servants understood clearly what was supposed to happen. All three had been given the same opportunity and the same responsibility. They'd been given different amounts of responsibility according to their abilities. But there was always the same expectation. But in this case, the message is being ready does not just mean keeping your slate clean, but it means that one has been actively engaged in responsible, faithful service, which produces results for the master. And if one doesn't know, look at the adjectives in verse 26. It says, you wicked and lazy servant. You were expected to accomplish something, and you did nothing. And just like the servants, we are expected to accomplish something. It's like the parable near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, back in Matthew 7, that Jesus says we are expected to be fruitful, and we will be known by the fruit that we produce. But there's more to the application than that, and it may be obvious, but it's quite serious. If you look at the application as a whole, those who were faithful in their responsibilities in the kingdom would be given more responsibilities, but they would also share in their master's happiness. Those who were unfaithful in their responsibilities and opportunities for the kingdom would lose what little they had. They're characterized by the master as being wicked and lazy, and they were thrown outside into the darkness away from the master. And they will have traded their share of the master's happiness. Instead of the master's happiness, they get weeping and gnashing of teeth. Gnashing of teeth is this symbol of you grind your teeth in extreme pain or worry, and they traded that for spending time with their master and his happiness. The readiness means, and it's the point of the parable, readiness means we accomplish something positive for the master. Faithfulness is faithfully performing our responsibilities, and faithfulness is action and bearing fruit, so that when the master returns, he can say, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into your master's happiness. That's the second parable. The third parable is as close as Jesus comes to answering their actual question, and this time it's about the real end times, because the question had been, what will be the signs of your coming and the end of the age. Now Jesus talks about the end of the age, but he never really answers their question in the way that they would have liked, because he started the answer by telling them, no one knows when this is going to happen. So I can't tell you the signs of the coming. Nobody knows. The angels don't know. The Son doesn't know. Only the Father knows. I can't tell you that because nobody knows. So the questions about when this will be are meaningless and useless and silly. Instead, his answer explains, because nobody knows, I am going to warn you that you must be ready, because you don't know when the Son of Man is going to come. You don't know when the Master is going to return. So you must be ready. Being ready also means being faithful and producing fruit. And the consequence of being ready and being faithful will be a reward. Being unready and unfaithful will be punishment. It's also interesting to note in looking at these parables that they sort of build in detail and in length from the early ones back in chapter 24 that's just very short and almost a sentence or two or a verse or two, to these last two, which are the longest of all of them, and especially this last one, which is the most detailed and the closest that he comes and that he can come to answering the question that they ask. This is the parable of the sheep and the goats. It's not really a parable. It's more better described as a simile or an allegory, and where people in the parable are represented by sheep and goats. And it's a parable that is often misunderstood. So we'll try to explain some of that misunderstanding and clear it up as we go through. But whether a parable or an allegory, whether misunderstood or clear and easy to understand, what is clear is that this parable begins in the time frame of their question. Now we are finally talking about the last days, and we're finally talking about the return of the Son of Man. Not about signs of his coming. This is the actual return. Because he says and the messages are like this: the Son of Man will come in his glory. The time may be a question, but whether he will come or not is never a question. He will come. And when he comes, all of his angels will come with him. He will sit on a throne. He will come in power, and in power over all of the nations, because all of the nations of the world will be gathered before him. And he will separate them, the people of all of the nations of the world, like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. And the message of this parable, one very important message, is that there's no middle ground. One is either a sheep or a goat, but never anything in between. There is nothing in between. The whole world is responsible to the Son of Man when he comes. By this time, the whole world should have heard of him. They should know about him, and they are and will be responsible. The Son of Man acts as both shepherd of the sheep and the goats, but also as judge. And right and left are significant in the Jewish mind in Jesus' day. Right is to sit at one's right hand is a position of favor and authority. To sit at one's left hand is a position of less favor and less authority. The sheep are also a common symbol in Jesus' day and in the Old Testament, because the sheep represent the people of God. So we're talking about the whole world. Part of the world are the people of God, and part are those in the world who are not of the people of God. The people of God are the sheep. They go on the right. Those people who are not the people of God go on the left, and they are the goats. The king first speaks to the sheep, and And king is an important word. It's the ultimate destiny of the Son of Man as he comes. When he returns, is he comes as king to rule over all of the nations of the world. That's why they gather before him as king. And that's why he executes judgment over them, because he is king. Now, the decision on the judgment on which our sheep and goats actually comes from the Father. So this is consistent with Revelation 21 and the great white throne judgment. But the king here in the parable is the executor of the judgment, and he will separate the sheep from the goats. And we'll see what the parable is trying to say us. The message to those on the right, to the sheep, to the people of God, is that you are blessed by the Father, that you will be given an inheritance, which is a kingdom that's been prepared for you as part of God's eternal plan. But he doesn't tell, well, he tells them a little bit about why they're selected as sheep. He says they cared for him, but they don't really understand. They say, why? Now, they don't understand, but another name for the sheep here is the righteous. The goats are not named the unrighteous, but one would expect that to be their name. But the righteous, the sheep, say, well, why? We don't remember ever caring for you in person. And he says, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Part of the question is, what does that mean? And that's been over the years misunderstood by some people, maybe by many people, because at times it's been thought that this statement represents either one, a universal social gospel, meaning that the purpose of the followers of Jesus is to go take care of all of the poor and needy and sick or imprisoned in the world. And second, that it teaches us salvation by works, not by faith. And part of the misunderstanding is that perhaps the parable means one or both of those things. So we'll ask several questions to help us clarify the meaning. The first of those is, who are Jesus' brothers and sisters? The second is, what does he mean when he says the least? And then, what are these things and actions that he's talking about, the visiting and giving of clothes and feeding and giving water and all? What are these actions? What do they mean that look like work? So we'll look at those next. First of all, who are Jesus' brothers and sisters? Jesus himself answers that question back in Matthew 12. You may remember the passage. Jesus is teaching. He's inside a house. His mother and his brothers come looking for him. They are worried about him. And someone says to Jesus, that your mother and brothers are waiting for you outside. And then this is Jesus' reply in Matthew 12:48. He says, who are my mother and who are my brothers? Then he points to his disciples and says, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my mother, as my brother and sister and mother. So who are Jesus' brothers and sisters? This is not just some sort of a statement about the universality of humanity, although God does care for all of the people created in his image. But that's not what this statement's about. When Jesus talks about his brothers and sisters, he has already said his brothers and sisters are those who do the will of the Father in heaven. So that part's pretty clear. He's already answered the questions. They are Jesus' disciples and followers. And that statement, the whole statement then, the one about caring for Jesus' followers, is similar to the one just a little earlier than that, also in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 10, where he says, anyone, speaking to the disciples, anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciples, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. So it's not just that the sheep on the side, it's not just that the sheep have been charitable and have been nice sheep and have taken care of other sheep who were not as fortunate. They may have done that, but what they're being recognized for is they actually recognized the kingdom and the people of the kingdom, and they responded to the kingdom and the kingdom's people, not just that they were nice sheep. What does the least mean there? Perhaps it means least important in the world's eyes, but it's also used up here in Matthew 10 in verse 42, where he talks about these little ones, and they are his disciples. So again, the least of these are also his disciples. He's talking about his disciples, and really how the world has responded to the kingdom and to his disciples, that the world will be judged by its response to the kingdom, to the message of the kingdom and the people of the kingdom, that the response indicates a condition of their hearts. This is not some kind of a salvation of works. It's very consistent with what the brother of Jesus, James, says, where he talks about the importance of tying faith and works together, that faith with no actions to go along with it is simply dead and useless. And that's not new with James. In fact, the writer in Genesis, Moses, talks about God counting Abraham as being righteous, and there's that word again that was applied to the sheep. God counts Abraham as being righteousness because of what he has done for him. It's also consistent. We talked about the Sermon on the Mount just a little bit in producing fruit, and it's consistent with that Jesus expects the followers to produce fruit, and it's consistent with the parables that immediately precede this. So I hope that clears up some of the confusion, that when he's talking to the sheep and goats and what they have done, it has to do with their response to the kingdom and to the people of the kingdom. Those are the brothers and sisters that he's talking about, and it's clear from what he said in the past. Now, he has some pretty harsh words for the goats. He looks at the goats on the left and says, "You leave my presence now. You will be cursed. Your place is not with me, but with the devil and his angels in eternal punishment." Pretty harsh words. So why are they cursed and why are they punished? Well, they had turned their back on the king and the kingdom and the people and the messengers of the kingdom, and their actions in doing those sorts of things reflected their hearts, that in doing that they had turned their back on him. And in making that choice, their fate had been determined by their own choice. This is not that God is mean and vindictive, that the goats chose to turn their backs on God. And because that is what they chose, he will give them what they wanted, and they will not be with him. Now the goats respond. And then the Lord answers them. The goats missed the point. They're just like the third servant in the parable of the talents, that real response to the kingdom and to the king would produce an action, a positive action, and a change in the heart that would be that, and that change in heart was reflected by a change in action and by fruits that they produced. That response to the kingdom, the king, the message of the kingdom, and the messengers of the kingdom would determine whether one would be a sheep or a goat, whether one would be considered prepared or unprepared when the Son of Man comes, whether one would be judged as having been faithful or unfaithful, whether one would be rewarded or whether one would be punished, and whether one would be with or would be separated from the king for eternity. A very, very strong message at the end of the series of parables that there are really only two options. There are only two classes of people. There are sheep or there are goats. There are people who are going to be with Jesus or separated from Jesus. There are people who were for the kingdom or against the kingdom. There were people who will be blessed or cursed. There were people who will be rewarded or punished for eternity. And we can choose to be one or the other. God does not stick us in one place or the other. We are there by our choice. But there is no middle ground. So we need to be ready and we need to be faithful. As we look back through the parables that we've seen in this set of teaching on the Mount of Olives, you can see how they start short, they start simple, and they finish up with more detail and really as being much weightier. Remember, at the beginning, he answers the second question and then continues on with the parables. And his answer was, "No one knows when the Son of Man will return, not the angels, not even the Son, only the Father." And then he tells the parables to explain this. The first example or parable that he gives is Noah. Everybody was living just as usual. The flood was unexpected. The Son of Man will be like that too. So you need to be on the alert. Next short example, he says, two examples really, where one would be taken, another one left. Same thing. Everyone was living as usual. The time when Jesus was coming would be, or the Son of Man was coming, would be unknown and unexpected. So people needed to be on the alert. The third little parable was the thief breaking into the house. They said if the head of the household had known the time when the thief would break in, he would have been prepared. But he didn't know. And Jesus is coming at a time you do not know, and a time you do not think he will be coming. So you need to be ready. Then the last parable in chapter 24 with faithful and unfaithful servants. You know, there were two servants. One was faithful and one was not. The master was gone. He left them in charge of things. And the master returned at an unexpected time. And the one servant had been faithful and the other had not been. In fact, had been pretty mean and nasty. The faithful servant would be rewarded. The unfaithful servant was punished. And here, now we've said so far you needed to be ready, you needed to be on the alert, but here being ready also meant being faithful. Then there were the 10 bridesmaids, and 5 were prepared and 5 were not. This is a little longer parable. The bridegroom was going to come at an unexpected time, and those who were unprepared would be left outside. So the application or the message was you need to be alert, you need to be prepared, or you'll be left outside. And here being ready was also being prepared. The parable of the talents, the 3 servants. And again, there's a little more detail each time in all of these. The talents were given according to abilities. Those given the talents were responsible to use and manage and increase them. The master would return after a long time, but they didn't know when the master would return. And the servants who worked and increased their talents for the master were first given more responsibilities, and second, were given a share in their master's happiness. The third servant, who did not use the talents for the master, in fact, lost it, and he was severely punished. He was separated from the master. So here, being prepared is being faithful, and being prepared and faithful means performing the responsibilities given by the master. That's the additional piece of information in this particular parable. And one who is faithful and prepared and has performed the master's responsibilities will be rewarded. But being faithful and being prepared were not just avoiding evil. Being faithful and being prepared meant positive action, performing the master's work while the master was gone. And then the last parable, the sheep and the goats. And this was the return of the Son of Man. This is the real thing. And it involves the whole world, not just the time of Noah, not just a few people in the field, not just a thief in the house, or faithful and unfaithful servants or 10 bridesmaids. This involves the whole world, and they were classified either as sheep, who were God's people, and goats, who were not. The sheep were faithful to their responsibilities and to the kingdom because they recognized the kingdom, the king, and the messengers of the kingdom, and they acted on that. And he gives examples on what that means, and the goats just were not. The goats did not recognize it, even though they should have. The sheep were richly rewarded. The goats were severely punished. And here, living a life of being faithful means being prepared, but means being responsive to the kingdom and the king and the messengers of the kingdom, and actually caring for the messengers of the kingdom. If we are prepared like that, we don't have to worry. If we don't, we become like the goats. But the goats, in the end, get exactly what they have chosen, because they chose not to be with the king and not to associate with the king and his kingdom. And so that is their reward. They do not get to associate with the king and those of his kingdom. So the end message and summary message of the whole set of teaching on the Mount of Olives about the return of Jesus is be ready and be faithful, because Jesus will return at the time when no one knows and no one expects. That's the end of our lesson from Matthew for today. During the next session, we'll be in Matthew 26, and we'll talk about things like the Last Supper, the institution of the Lord's Supper, and about Jesus' time in Gethsemane. So thank you very much. I'll see you for the next session.